special guest, Jason Luttrell. Jason Luttrell is a project leader experienced in several industries, including the construction industry, nonprofits, oil and gas, and defense and contracting. And today, he will share his expert opinion on effective collaborative communication. With that, I ask that you give your undivided attention to Jason, as he will be the next person to speak. Thank you. Jason, take it off.
Thanks very much, Gibson. So this is going to be a high-level presentation, not a lot of data, and I've noticed since I'm going to UConn right now, and we've moved everything to virtual, right? That I have a lot easier time paying attention to a face talking to me rather than a PowerPoint, unless that PowerPoint's heavily data-driven. So no PowerPoint, face-to-face presentation, and I'd like your feedback at the end, if that's okay, on whether you would have preferred, a PowerPoint versus a face-to-face presentation, right? So face-to-face being via video, obviously. So we're going to talk about collaborative dialogue, and it's going to be high-level, attitudes focused, right? And we're going to look at perspectives versus specific tools. Now, the reason that is because there's tons and tons of information out there on active listening and various techniques that you can do to help keep people engaged. But a lot of times, what I find is that in the heat of the moment, when things get when they get a little off track, or when I get emotional or particularly focused on something, that I forget my tools, right? And my perspective is really what keeps me either on track or off track. So we're going to talk about managing perspective and how to do that, right? So collaborative dialogue, particularly in a group, can be difficult to sustain or predict. I'm sure that we've all had experienced very productive collaborative dialogue, and if your experience is anything like mine, it's great, even inspiring when it happens, and it can be very frustrating when it doesn't. The unpredictability is particularly frustrating sometimes. Now, I recently read a Harvard Business Review article that was about level 5 leadership, and in that article, they brought out the two specific traits about level 5 leadership and what they have in common. That article is abstracted from a book by James Collin called Good to Great. I'm sure a lot of you read that book. It's a pretty popular book. But two things in that article really struck me. First is that there's two primary characteristics that differentiate a level 5 leader from a level 4 and below, and those two characteristics are humility and professional will. Now, I would have expected that to be different, right? I would have expected something like, inspiring ability to speak or some other highly technical leadership skill, but it's just these two fundamental things, professional will and humility. And the second is that the author had no idea how to become a level 5 leader. So we have humility and professional will, and he has no idea how to get those qualities. To me, that's half a solution. So what does level 5 leadership have to do with collaboration? And the answer is a lot, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So many of the things that we want, right? We don't spend the most amount of effort on. So let me say that again. Many of the things that we think we want aren't the things that we spend all of our effort on, right? And that's because we're very poorly informed about ourselves as a rule. There's been a trove of research done on how often people get their own motivations wrong. They remember their experiences wrong. They describe themselves wrong. They can't even reliably know whether they know something. The bottom line is that we can't trust ourselves. In fact, if you really read the research, it's amazing how incredibly bad we are at processing information, even when that information is our own experiences. This manifests in a number of pervasive biases, and that's really what we're going to kind of talk about next. On the one hand, right, we can't trust ourselves, and our biases basically give us this highly filtered view of the world that the only thing we can really know about wrong, right? On the other hand, our biases are innate human tendencies. These behaviors are a function of how our brains work, and they're key to our survival. Without them, we probably would be locked into analysis paralysis over every mundane action that we take in a day. Most of us would never even be able to make it out of the house in the morning. So the biases or mental shortcuts are good. We need them. We'll never get rid of them. Not only are they good, but they're very, very effective at producing predictable results. So if you think about it, if you take every effort, every action ever done by all humans who've ever been alive, the vast majority are successful. You probably successfully do over 100 things to arrive at work in the morning. In fact, you successfully do these 100+ things hundreds of times in a year for many years, all just to get to work, right? So we take these mental shortcuts so readily that we don't even know we're doing it, which is great most of the time. It makes us fast and agile thinkers, but sometimes these mental shortcuts don't work. If you need to do logic, you can't do mental shortcuts. It produces invalid logic. Often in science, our mental shortcuts produce these biases that lead to errors. Like when for years, physicists denied that it was possible to throw a curveball. I think that they figured out how in the 90s. And up until then, the physicists were denying that curveballs were actually curveballs, despite the fact that we watched them every week on TV. Or when surgeons for years refused to sterilize their tools, despite widely published and research of several scientists throughout Europe. Lister was probably the most famous one, that said that, you know, sterilizing your tools was a life-saving measure, and you can increase survivability rates of surgical procedures by huge percentages. Yet the doctors of the day, who were the scientists of the day, still refused to believe that research because it was against their biases, right? So, and ultimately, you know, when we're in a collaborative situation, when someone has an idea or solution that's contrary to your own preconceived notions, we tend to dismiss those, right? And we miss opportunities when we do so. So, and we also shut down collaboration when we do that, and that's the problem that we're trying to solve here, right? So there are certain situations when our biases blind us to the truth, and we're really bad at knowing when we're biased. This makes it difficult to know what we know or know what we don't know. It's so hard, in fact, that for 2,500 years, philosophers have studied the problem of knowing, and from my view, don't seem to have made very much progress in the last 1,500 years. So we've got this huge problem, right, of these biases and when we know them and when we don't know them. So let's talk about a few of the biases real quickly. First is, and most of you have probably heard of these, but we're going to go through them and kind of highlight them. So cognitive dissonance, right? When we have conflicting beliefs or behaviors that causes us distress in some way, emotional distress, that we tend to change the belief or behavior in order to reduce the discomfort. So the problem is that the change is towards comfort rather than towards truth. So when we have a behavior that we find very satisfying or pleasurable, we'll change a conflicting belief that may be telling us that that behavior is wrong or not good in order to preserve the greater pleasure associated with behavior. And again, this is without much regard to the truth. So, you know, think about people that forsake religion because they don't like something that religion says is wrong, or you know, political parties. If you're, you know, think about your political view and how people opposed to your political view don't make any sense, and they have the exact same view of people of your political view, right? So, in this time of political polarization, that should be pretty easy to imagine, right? So, so that's cognitive dissonance, right? Confirmation bias, the tendency to treat new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs, whether it does or doesn't actually confirm that belief. Inversely, the tendency to dismiss non-conforming evidence as anecdotal. Now, this is pervasive, right? We see it all over the place. We see it in science, we see it in politics, we see it every single day in religion, everything that matters. We have these confirmation biases. And for everyone out there that says that they're data driven or they make their decisions based on data, I put forward this confirmation bias as probable cause that's not true, right? Everybody does it. Nobody doesn't do confirmation bias. The other big one is actor-observer bias, right? The tendency to blame internal causes over other people's behavior and external causes over our own. So what that means is if you interrupt me, I might think it's because you're self-important, discourteous, right? But if I interrupt you, it's because there was something really important that needed to be interjected. And same thing at a red light, right? If you see somebody run a red light, you're more likely to think that person is a selfish jerk than if you run the red light and you invent all kinds of external reasons why you had to run that red light, right? So these three biases, these cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, and active observer bias, are all enough, right, for us to know that we have a very filtered view of the world. But there's tons of other biases out there as well that color our view and make our view really unreliable with regards to truth, especially when that truth is something that we are sort of emotionally invested in, right? So another key here is that we're really not very good at identifying truth, but we're exceptionally good at identifying possible consequences, right, to things that we care about. So this is because because what we're focused on is what we're caring about, not what's true, and that's what these biases drive, right? In fact, we're so good at identifying possible consequences that we often identify consequences that don't happen. There's an old saying that says that economists have predicted 20 of the last 5 recessions, right? So we identify all kind of possible consequences, but not probable consequences, and then we act on those in a way to avoid or achieve them as we prefer. So when we're wrong, we try again. Now, this behavior can explain the success of people like Sam Walton, right? And the failure of the Vietnam War. Sam Walton pushed through and saw the consequence of great success with his vision for big box stores, despite multiple failures that most of us probably would have given up on. And the Vietnam War was a study in avoidance behavior, really. Our leaders made a lot of decisions trying to avoid projected bad outcomes associated with communist resolution that ended up frustrating their ends in Vietnam itself. So how do we counteract these biases, right? So I don't know what that was. Okay, I guess it was nothing. So how do we counteract these biases? The bottom line is that, or the first thing you have to do is that you have to admit that you have a problem. Kind of like the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step program, right? So as soon as you're able to admit, or you're able to acknowledge that you can't rely on yourself, then you've taken the first step towards the kind of humility needed to start relying on others. Now, by relying on others, I don't mean totally relying. I mean really relying on their input. And I don't mean just seeking their input, but I mean actually relying on their input. And finally, you have to expect and embrace failure in order to learn from it. So let's cover the first one, right, which is admitting that you have a problem. So this is not just some tidy assent to the will. It has to be a deep conviction. You have to own the fact that you're hopelessly biased. You have to convince yourself, right, that you're you're part of the problem, and that you need others and other people's perspectives to you know, to help solve solutions in these collaborative environments. So one thing you can do is identify examples when you see your biases in action. You can read about them so that you can name them and get better at observing them in yourself and others, right? So you can do your own research. And there's lots of stuff out there that you can just Google cognitive bias, and you'll have troves of information. And know that for every one bias you see, there's 10 that you miss, right? You have to internalize this deep mistrust of both your and others' assessments of truth. You have to be your own biggest skeptic. Then you have to be okay with that frailty as a necessary human condition. You can't get beyond it, and your biases will be your constant companion. So true humility lies in understanding your own profound inadequacy. And you'll notice that the humility is one of the level 5 leadership traits. It's also one of the level 5 communicator traits. We can't communicate with others unless we're humble enough to be at their service in a conversation. And so this is where I think a lot of times I get derailed. I'm sure a lot of people do as well. Once the conversation turns contentious or passionate, you know, or starts to go in a direction that you don't expect, a lot of times that lack of humility in that self-reliance starts to kick in, and we stop engaging in our listening skills. You know, we stop checking back with the people that we're talking to make sure they understand where we're coming from. We start to talk faster, things like that, right? All these great communication tools that we've learned over the years start to go away, and we go back to the old standbys, right? Now, so that's admitting that you have the problem, right? Next, relying on others. This is really where the professional will comes in. So the way I see it, there's kind of two parts to professional will. There's knowing the right thing to do and then doing it at all costs. Relying on others is more aligned with the knowing the right thing to do. Relying on others is the first part of creating that authentic dialogue. And authentic is the key word here, because it's when you're fully invested in the conversation, because you need to get something out of it, right? You need what the other person has, as opposed to being there to convince the other people of your own viewpoint. So the key, and people know, right? They pick up on over time whether or not you're authentic or not, and there's subconscious cues that we're all very good at realizing, and we tend to notice when we're being sold, right, versus being consulted. So when you rely on others, you got to do so in a way that engages them in the process, right? I like to think of a solution, excuse me, as a sort of community property, and I try to make it my job to get everyone else to see it as their community property as well. I do this by throwing my ideas out there as a first stab, right, or a tentative sort of solution in the hopes that someone else will make it better. And I say that when I throw the idea out, right? I don't roll it out like the answer. I roll it out as I think I usually use the words, let's throw this up against the wall and see what sticks, right? And that sort of invites that criticism, right? And I always thank the person by name if we're in a group who can identify something that I missed or who doesn't. And when you do that, when you highlight the valid objections to stuff, it really doesn't take long for people in the group to feel motivated to criticize an idea, right? Especially if you're thanking them for it and calling them out. And I also constantly try to dovetail multiple people's contributions into a single formulation, right? And I think this is key when you're trying to create community property. I'll share a story about Charles Darwin, right? And I don't know all the names here. I just know the overall idea. There were two other people that came up with sort of precursor theories, and Charles Darwin, when he went on the Beagle, put those two theories together and added some sketches and came up with the his natural selection theory, right? And so nobody knows the names. I don't know the names of the two guys that he used, but we all know the theory, right? And Charles Darwin ultimately got the credit, and we all think of Charles Darwin as the one who came up with that theory, but really he didn't, right? And all good ideas are like that, or most anyways. I'm sure that there are some that somebody came up with on their own, but I think most of them are built on the shoulders of other people who sort of provided these precursors to the final solution. Albert Einstein is another example, with his theory of relativity. He was standing on the work of other physicists in order to come up with his final, solution to the variability of time. So, so this dovetailing multiple people's contributions into a single formulation, right, a single idea, works especially well when you have cross-functional teams and you bring other people in. You have other perspectives, and it tends to reduce the dominance of any one function over others. And it's important to call out, right, who contributed the different parts of the ideas when you're kind of reformulating. And it gives you this sense of group ownership again, and allows for this idea of community property really develop in your group. I also try to explain intermediate solutions in terms of the observations of the other group members. So I'll say, to the point of, to Bob's point, and then bring his point out and how it affects the intermediate solution. And then ultimately, when you have objections that come up and people throwing problems out, if turning those objections back onto the person that objects, right, in trying to elicit a fix, you tend to head off the group going down the road of just complaining essentially, or talking about all the problems, right? And that's in my experience, it's not been very, very fruitful. I've wasted many a meeting on a complaining session, right? So every time you get an objection, if you flip it into what's the fix for that objection, then that helps. In all of this, I try to diminish my own contributions and extol the contributions of others, right? So when I go into a collaborative meeting, my primary goal, and I have to tell myself this, right? Before I go into the meeting, I set my own primary goal as the collaboration itself, not the solution. If I can be the one member who keeps everyone engaged and keeps the groups on task, then usually everybody else collectively outperforms my own abilities to solve the problem before us, and they're all focused on the solution, right? I don't have to focus on the solution because everybody's focused on the solution. But it only takes one person really in a group to kind of be the glue that holds it together and keep that collaborative dialogue going. And that's where this innate ability to identify consequences really comes into play, right? If you're laser focused on the solution, then you can get tunnel vision and create all kinds of unintended consequences to your collaborative effort. But if you're laser focused on the collaboration, you will identify and prevent all kinds of unintended consequences to your collaborative effort, including getting the group off track, right? So we have a bad ability to identify truth, but we have a great ability to identify consequences. The trick is to move our perspective so that we're focused on the right consequences that's going to hurt the eventual solution, right? And that in a collaborative environment, the consequences that we're worried about are the ones that destroy the the contributions and the assimilation of the contributions of the people in the group. So, so the third thing, right? We've got know that you have the problem. We got rely on others, and then the third thing is embrace failure. So, and expect failure, right? Expect and embrace failure in order to learn from it. So this is where the second part of professional will comes in, right? First part is knowing the right thing to do. The second part is doing it at all costs. So failure needs to be recovered from and learned from. And I think everybody knows that, right? But it's difficult to recover from something that takes you by complete surprise. It's also difficult to learn from something that you take no responsibility for. So expecting failures gives us the perspective, right, that that allows us to respond to them and not be derailed by the fact that there is a failure. We can discuss potential failure modes ahead of time. We can talk about what those failure modes may mean, and you can do the same for yourself, right? When it comes to this collaborative dialogue that that you foster. You can't be afraid to iterate, right? You can't be afraid to go back to the drawing board, and you don't want to chase a failed solution into ruin. Ultimately, that's the embrace, right? The longer we wait to acknowledge that something is going off the rails, the worse the train wreck is when it happens. So embracing failure really refers to acknowledging it very quickly and responding to it immediately as well. So the expectation of failure is really a function of understanding that our biases are unavoidable and that we're absolutely going to get stuff wrong. One of the best ways to kill a collaborative effort is to form a lynch mob when something goes wrong and look for somebody to blame. Not only will you kill the collaboration, but you'll sacrifice creativity and innovation. Planning for failures helps us minimize their impacts, but responding to failures with an optimistic resolve to fix the problem is going to do one key thing: fix the problem. This is also where discipline is required. If the solution is community property, then no one can be a scapegoat, unless it's you, right? If you're responsible for the group, then you can take responsibility for the failure. And if you take responsibility for that failure, if you're responsible for collaboration, you can take responsibility for the failure. And then you can rely on the group to fix the problem again. And you can also learn from the failure so that the group doesn't repeat the failure. So that's embrace, right? And the importance can't be understated. Most people seek to distribute or shift blame. These people rarely learn from their mistakes. On the other hand, people who take responsibility, whether deserved or not, tend to find ways to learn from their failures and prevent them in the future. Mistakes can be avoided by many people, even if they're only made by one person. And that's key in a collaboration, right? Failures, bad plans, bad ideas happen. And a lot of times our solutions require many, many things to go right. And if one thing goes wrong, then it ends up derailing the whole effort, especially on the stuff that I work on. And even though usually you can kind of trace back a problem to some set of root causes, what you can't trace are the missed opportunities that that happened that would have prevented those failures, right? Prevented those root causes. So and ultimately, if the problem is a collaborative problem, right? Like dialogue was shut down, or one person didn't feel like they could adequately contribute, then you'll never see that as your root cause. So we always have to kind of be on the lookout for ways that we're breaking down the communication in our collaborative groups, because we'll never know, right, what we missed because of that. So in conclusion, so you can get rid of your biases, right? But doing these three things will align your biases, or at least help to align your biases with your goals. One interesting thing about the HBR article is that leaders, the level 5 leaders that were interviewed, didn't really know that they were the reason for their success, or at least didn't appear to know. They said things like, "We're lucky. We had the right people in place. I had a great team." By contrast, they also interviewed level 4 leaders, which would be like Lee Iacocca. And those guys knew exactly why they were great, right? And they thought of themselves as level 5 leaders. So it genuinely appeared to level 5 leaders as though they were just blessed with the right set of circumstances at the right time. Of course, they were wrong about that. The level 5 leaders are most probably the reason behind their success. By contrast, level 4 leaders knew all about their success and saw themselves as great level 5 leaders and could tell you why. And they were wrong about that too, right? So everybody was wrong and nobody was right. But the best leaders are the level 5 leaders were focused on the accomplishments of their companies and their employees, right? They were focused on the right results. So when they were asked what made them great, in their biases, they simply referred back to the things that they were focused on. The level 4 leaders, Lee Iacocca, did the same thing, but they were focused on themselves. And that's why Lee Iacocca failed to set up Chrysler for long-term success. And Sam Walton, right, didn't fail to set Walmart up for long-term success. So level 5 leaders, they didn't get rid of their biases. They just aligned them with their goals. Just like, admitting the problem, relying on others, and admitting failure can help you do the same thing as a level 5 communicator. Thanks very much. So any questions?
It's true. After a while, I just keep ordering stuff from the grocery store, and then I'm like, I didn't really need that. So my freezer's
Hi, good
full.
morning, Shirley.
What's in there?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I've had it, but it's pork, right? Not pork.
To bring to nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, like, what does it taste like?
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's going well, but I think Karen, I know we haven't gotten a chance to talk about. I know Ren and I definitely want to say.
Morning, Christine.
Okay, everybody, hi. This is Paul. I'm going to unmute everybody's phone, but can you please focus your attention onto Jason? And if you have any questions for Jason, I'm going to do that now. All right. Jason, you there? You ready? Okay.
Has been of good quality, haven't been any issues at all. So thank you. As you know, there was honestly.
There's a question that on the HBR article. That HBR article is good to great.
Workers were going to have to go.
Like some companies fail and others.
That helped a lot from a planning.
Jason.
As you know,
Jason,
there were definitely challenges around
mute everybody
PII
again and just unmute your line because
it's
just cross talk.
Pursuit's job much more complicated because we could share some things and not others.
Hold on, I'm not there yet. I gotta find you. Jason, unmute. Okay, Jason, you're unmuted now.
All right, so there was a question about the HBR article that I was referencing. It's good to great, and there's another byline I can't remember, but that's it. If you Google HBR good to great, you'll find it. Characteristics of level 4 leadership. He didn't really get into that. He really just kind of contrasted level 4 leaders with level 5 leaders, and Lee Iacocca, it was a kind of a typical example of somebody who would be a level 4 leader who was very effective, but didn't possess the humility and didn't possess the professional will to do the right things for the company. He did the right things for himself, right? But he was focused on short-term benefit short-term returns, short-term stock prices, and ultimately Chrysler went into as much trouble as he got him out of, right after he left. So, and that's another question on the chat. You guys aren't watching chat, so anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, Jason here, there's a question here. I don't know if you could read it. It says, what is the characteristics of the level 4 leadership? Is that what you just answered?
Yeah, I did. So,
okay, so I have some questions that I'll ask. As you were going through your presentation, can you provide some practical examples of like how to control a meeting that's going sideways or negative? You know, you mentioned you don't want to have a negative outcome, but how do you get people that are going negative and bring them back out of that? You know, how do you bring them back to where you want them to be?
Well, if everybody in the meeting is sort of in the zone of malleable, right? Then flipping complaints back to solutions and asking for the way to fix that is a good way to do it. If that doesn't work, another thing that I try to do is reformulate the question, right? A lot of times reformulating the question gives you a better response, right, or a better answer than just talking about the problems, because it flips people's views to a different perspective. So I'll give an example. We were talking about a problem with the design, right? Actually, no, it wasn't a design, it was a document. A problem with the document, and the document had, it was a specification document, and it had specifications from 2 different systems. And in those 2 different systems, we were splitting one system and giving it to one contractor for them to kind of own. And then the other system was staying with the government, essentially, for ownership. And there was some angst associated with whether or not this specification should remain as it was, right, or whether it should be split between these 2 owners and sort of future state. And so there was a lot of conversation about what's better or worse, and people didn't know. So I reformulated the question, and I said, what bad thing is going to happen if we leave it as it is, right? What are we trying to avoid? And when I reformulated it that way, we got better answers from the people that had the problem, and then we were able to very quickly actually identify the right solution moving forward. So in reformulating the question really goes back to knowing what the right thing to focus on is. So if people get sidetracked, a lot of times it's because they're sidetracked on a red herring or a rabbit trail or some distracting shiny object, and reformulating the question so it brings the right thing back into focus. Keep going.
Okay, so Jason, thank you. There's a couple more. I don't know if you could read the chat. There are a couple more questions here. One is from Ben Daniels. How do you leverage these collaborative techniques when you are receiving pressure for the team to get it done, which doesn't always promote collaboration?
So, good question. I had this problem. I was building a dashboard for my director, right? And my director had asked for it a year ago, and my manager had done nothing with it, and he needed to deliver it by the end of the year. And so he comes to me and the group that I was in, and he said, we got to get this out the door. And of course, dashboards are replete with information, and we didn't really have an idea of what he wanted. So what we went back with to him was a list of stuff that we need in order to get it done. And then this negotiation took place, right? In which case, we got some of what we needed, but not all of it. We produced a thing, and we went through this iterative step. 6 iterative steps. And so the key here, right, was that initially the group was focused on getting the right thing out the door as fast as possible. And I shifted the focus to getting anything out the door even faster, so that the manager and the director could shoot holes in it. That's what we wanted. We wanted to know what they didn't like, right? So as a group, right, we collaborated with the manager and the director who had unrealistic expectations, by essentially throwing something up against the wall and saying, what's wrong with that? And when we phrased it that way, they were better able to give us the input. Ultimately, the problem was they didn't know what they wanted. They just wanted something shiny, right? So the next question.
Actually, the question from Jennifer, I think, is almost the same. What is the best techniques to deal with a leader that puts their motivation/needs first ahead of collaborative team's direction? The constant, I need this now versus working to the plan, vision derails in the long term, causing more chaos in the organization. As a middle of the line leader, are there any good ways to buffer and still try to make the leader happy without totally reprioritizing people every time?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a hard question. I think the different situations are going to require different responses. Ultimately, I think I try to create a environment between me and my my 1-ups and 2-ups, right, where they feel like I'm working with them, right? I think I told one of my managers that my job is to make your vision my goal, right? And so that helps, because then the leader is more likely to feel like they've got a sympathetic ear versus a non-sympathetic ear, and then after that, I think communication on what you need to get the job done is early and often, right, is key to letting them understand that that one, it's being worked on as fast as possible, and it, and what to expect in that process. I always fall back to iterative processes if possible. I'm a huge fan of throwing a product out early and letting it get murdered, because ultimately I always come back with something better than what I would have produced had I spent another 3 or 4 days on it perfecting it, right? And then had to get murdered anyways. So does that answer the question?
Okay, that was a yes, thank you.
All right.
All
So
right.
the next one is filtering biases for the team members. I don't think you can. You can get good at identifying the biases, right? You can study them, right? You can see them in action. You can see them in your own, on your own, and see how you engage in them. I do a lot of philosophy, and that's been sort of a great lab for me. There's meetup philosophy groups that I go to, and we kind of discuss things, and you can see people's cognitive biases very, very clearly in a philosophical discussion. And that's helped me identify them, but I don't even try to educate somebody on their own bias. It's a fool's errand. It's never going to work, or it's usually not going to work. And it's probably just going to make them angry, right? And get no results. So I tend to take the approach of aligning the biases with the goals rather than trying to counteract the bias, right? you can't make a human not a human. What you have to do is you have to work with your humanity. And so that's where my focus is.
Okay, I'm going to unmute the phones again. Can everybody please make sure your background is quiet? All right. All right, are there any other questions for Jason?
It's fine.
Okay, are there any other questions for Jason?
I know he's asking for other questions. Let me just see. Hold on one second, okay?
All right, so, whoops. I think I muted everybody. Okay, so everybody's unmuted again. Last call for questions. Jason?
That's
So-
correct. For contract setup, though, just to clarify, I think we were in agreement that it was 3.5.
Okay, I'm going back to
I need to understand. I don't know what it is. She's talking to somebody else. She's not even talking to her call.
That work will remain on
Yeah.
so.
All right, so everybody, let's see, unmute Jason. Jason, any last comments before we close the meeting?
Now, if I would like to get some feedback on whether a PowerPoint presentation would have been preferred versus the visual.
Well, Jason, a question just came in. I don't know if you could read it on the screen. How do you overcome your own biases?
Yeah, so I don't.
Well, how do you compensate for them then?
By trying to align my goals with the bias, right? That's ultimately when I go into a collaborative meeting, I make my goal the collaboration, right? Now, I'm going to go into that bias, but what I'm counting on is that my human tendency to see the different consequences, right? Potential consequences. A lot of those consequences, again, aren't going to show up. But if I'm focused on the collaboration, then I'll see and respond to potential problems to the collaborative effort, right? And not get distracted with the nuts and bolts of the solution. So I'm not really counteracting my own bias in that case. I'm just kind of working with it. Now, being familiar with biases and studying them and stuff like that, it helps you understand bias better. But even if you understand a bias, I mean, you still don't know whether you can step out of that bias or not. I mean, that's the truth. That's the fundamental truth, look at religion. You take the most, you take a devout person, a devout religious person. I'm devoutly Catholic, right? And I can study biases all day long and be thoroughly convinced, right, that I have a very low ability to know what's true and what's not true. Yet I am thoroughly convinced that Catholicism is the true religion, right? And so I can't step out of that bias. And I think it's kind of foolhardy to try, right?
Okay, everybody, we're right at 8:50. Anybody else have any questions? I'm reading Jason, I'm reading the responses in the chat room, and it looks like it's 3-1 in terms of a PowerPoint. But all right, I have one last question for you, Jason.
Yep.
How long does it take you when you get into a new position or you meet someone new to understand their biases and then be able to, I don't want to use the words control them, but get them to join your side or convince them that you're right, or,
Well, so, that's a good question. And it's, you can't control a bias and you can't get to know their biases because you're biased yourself, right? And so what you can know is you can know that we are biased, and we're biased in particular ways, okay? And so anytime you get somebody's input on something, if you get good at this, understanding cognitive dissonance, and social constructivism is another one, all this kind of stuff, right? You can kind of filter through what you're hearing, right, and be able to make a judgment on whether or not these biases are being kicked in. And ultimately, the biases kick in when we care about an outcome that's affected by what we're talking about, right? So if I'm studying, if I'm studying the habits of squirrels, I don't care what the habits of squirrels are, right? I'm just looking for how they act. And I'm probably not going to have a lot of biases associated with studying the habits of squirrels. If, on the other hand, I'm studying the habits of my political leaders, I'm going to be extremely biased when I start to look at that, right? Because I care very deeply about how they act. And since I've probably weighed in behind one and weighed against another, I'm gonna tend to throw that bias in one direction, and then I'm gonna have the opposite biases for the other person, right? So when you're talking to somebody and they're real passionate, or they seem like they're selling, then you can kind of turn on your bias filter and start to look a little deeper into what they're saying and try to pull out the facts, right? But that's really, you have to do that by reformulating the question and and flipping things back on them and looking for holes in what they're saying and asking them to bring those out. But you can't really counteract the bias. You can steer the conversation in a way that's productive, though, right? And that's where that formulating the question comes in. That's where flipping complaints back for solutions comes in.
All right. Okay. Last call for questions. Please put them in the it looks like we're going a little more towards PowerPoint is needed, but okay. So, okay. Again, we're at 8:53. I thank everybody for joining. Jason, thank you very much. It's a very interesting subject matter. I appreciate it. One thing you might want to send, and I'll send out with the PDU note with the notices, is the reference to that article you talked about right at the very beginning of your presentation.
I'll do that.
All right, thank you. Yeah, if you could send that to us, we can send it out. We'll resend it to everybody. I think that would be a big help. So, all right, Jason, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody joining. Jason, you will receive a certificate for your participation this morning, and we really appreciate your time. Last call, anybody else have any comments they want to put in the chat room? All right, and lastly, but not related to Jason's presentation, the folks who wanted to maybe do something in Danbury, if you want to send me your email addresses, I would be glad to organize a meeting and try to organize that. That would be a good thing. We could do it virtually or physically. Well, we can't do it physically yet, but hopefully we could do that. So, all right. So, Jason, thank you very much. And everybody have a great day. Stay healthy.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.